Hi. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about navel, which is a nice little acronym for nerves, artery, veins, and lymphatics. So tonight we're going to talk about fluids in the body and communication in the body. And it's fun because it starts bringing in more of the body together. You can see in this image of this sort of model, we've got extensive vessels and nerves going through the body. But we're going to start talking about the nervous system. And with the nervous system, it's basically our master control system for our body. Anything we think, anything we feel, our emotions, our actions, our movements, all of that, everything we sense is coming through our nervous system somehow. We have different functions that exist within the nervous system. We have our sensory inputs, so anything that we feel, anything that we see, we touch, pressure, temperature. We have these special receptors that pick up different changes that happen outside of us and inside of us and communicate that with our body. We have integration, where we have processing of that information that we're receiving. We make decisions about that information, whether they're conscious or subconscious. And then we have a motor output, which is our motion, our sweating, respiration, digestion, elimination, movements. This motor output is our nervous system activating muscles and glands and organs to create a response, to make an effect. So we have, I threw in this image here. It's actually a copyright image. It's from the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine, and this is a fully dissected nervous system in one piece here. And from here you can see so many different little offshoots of different nerves. We have these longer areas here, which would be our brachial plexus coming into our arms. We have so many spinal nerves coming off through the trunk of our body. You can see these long offshoots here, which are our legs, and we have sort of front and back to the legs. But I thought you might find that interesting, just to sort of see this whole dissection of our nervous system. That whole system is divided into a few different sort of segments, and we'll talk about those. So the nervous system is sort of divided into two main parts. We have our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything that comes off of that. So we have spinal nerves, which come off of the spinal cord. And we have cranial nerves, which come off of our brainstem. And within this peripheral nervous system, we have our sensory, which is also called afferent, and our motor, which is called efferent. So the easy way to remember this is motor leaves the spinal cord, it exits, it's efferent, which starts with an E. So we have the sensory nerves, which are everything that comes into the system, our motor nerves, which is everything that leaves our central nervous system and goes out into the body and causes effects. So within these motor efferent nerves, we have two more divisions, our somatic nervous system and our autonomic nervous system. So our somatic nervous system are impulses that leave our central nervous system and travel to our skeletal muscles to cause contraction of our skeletal muscles. Our autonomic nervous system is involuntary, and these are impulses that leave our central nervous system and have effects on our viscera, our smooth muscles in our vessels, and our glands. And then this is further divided into our sympathetic and our parasympathetic systems. We're going to talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic in a little bit more detail in a little bit. But for now, this is just sort of a general overview of the sort of the divisional breakdown of our nervous system, because there's quite a lot of things happening within it. So this is a neuron or a nerve cell. It's the structural unit of our nervous system. So we have many of these throughout our body, and they all have the same basic components. They just have different shapes depending on where they are. So they all have a cell body, which is sort of the part of the nerve that takes care of itself, it takes care of its functions, and attached to the cell body, we have these dendrites, these projections that are coming off the cell body. And this is where our nerves receive signals. So the communication language of the nervous system are neurotransmitters, and each neuron at the dendrites will receive neurotransmitters from another nerve, and it will come into these dendrites, and then it'll form an impulse that travels down this axon to the end of the axon, where we have these axon terminals. And at these axon terminals, and they release the neurotransmitter to continue sort of the discussion along to the next nerve, or make an effect on a muscle or a gland. The myelin sheath that's along the axon terminal here, that's sort of like a fatty layer that insulates the nerve, and it amplifies and it speeds up the impulse traveling down the nerve there. Every nerve has one axon terminal, and this might be a very long structure in the body. So for example,
Jen, sorry to interrupt you, but are you supposed to be changing slides? Because we still see the same one.
Excuse me. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Sorry, we just see the title page.
Oh, that's so strange. I am changing slides. Let's stop the sharing. Do you see a neuron right now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I had closed you and I couldn't see anyone. Okay, so you're on the neuron page, and okay. And so this title page is all that you've seen so far. Okay, let me quickly backtrack. So I apologize. Just speaking about the nervous system, I had pulled this photo. This is a fully dissected nervous system. And I just thought you might find it interesting just to sort of see how many offshoots of different nerves come through our body. From here up in, you have cranial nerves, you have your, like if you could see this in real life, you would see the optic nerve, which comes into our eyes up here, coming down into our whole spinal cord. Our brachial plexus coming off the neck, spinal nerves coming off the body here, and coming down into the legs, our lumbosacral plexus. So sorry you didn't see that before. I gave you this photo in your handouts, so it's just a breakdown of our nervous system. So we have our central nervous system, our peripheral nervous system, which we have our sensory and our motor, which divides into our somatic and autonomic. And then our autonomic divides into our sympathetic and parasympathetic. coming back into our nerve. So I gave you this photo as well, so hopefully you have it there. So I was just mentioning that we have one axon per nerve, and these axons might be really, really long. So in the example of, so for example, our sciatic nerve, which is a very long, extensive nerve in our body, it comes from our L4 to our S3, which is our lumbosacral plexus. The cell body would be in the spinal cord, and then this whole axon is going to travel all the way down the back of the leg into the foot. So that's a very long nerve in our body. Coming back into the terminal branches, the terminal branches of the axon, it releases neurotransmitters. And then what neurotransmitters do is they're just like little communication chemicals, and they'll either excite something and make it do more of something, or they'll inhibit something and sort of dampen the effect of something. Yeah, so we have these nerves. We have our sensory, which comes into our body. We have our motor, which leaves the central nervous system. And then we also sometimes have interneurons, which are nerves sort of in a pathway of nerves. And those usually happen within the spinal cord, within the central nervous system. And so just a very brief introduction to the brain. And you guys can still see this new slide. It's all good. Okay, perfect. So a very brief introduction to the brain, because we're going to talk a little bit about some communication up into the brain today. But obviously we can't go into very much detail. But some main centers of the brain are cerebral cortex, which is this sort of beige, orangey colored area. This is our area of our conscious mind. This is our area of our language, our communication, our memory, our ability to understand. It's also the area where we sort of decide we're going to do voluntary movement. So decide to go through a sun salutation or walk up the stairs or pick up your cat. It's the area that we would really think of as our mind. We have this diencephalon, which is a few different little structures. It's more in the center here. So first one is our thalamus, which is in this orange coral color here. This is a really interesting structure because it's kind of like the gatekeeper of what travels into our mind, into our brain. We have all kinds of signals all the time making an effect on our body. We're constantly overloaded with all different kinds of stimulus. And all of it comes up into our brain through our brainstem. And this thalamus organizes and it edits that information and it sends it off to the next area. So it's really like a gatekeeper. It's a center where all this information comes in. And it's really important because if we didn't have this area sort of editing all this info that comes up, we'd be totally overwhelmed in our minds. It's sort of the area that allows certain things to drop away. So for example, when you put your clothes on in the morning, you initially feel like how the fabric feels on you, the weight of the clothes, maybe the warmth of the clothes, but you're not constantly consciously aware of your clothes on you all day. At a certain point, you put them on, you forget about them. They're no longer the important task of the day. And you might not think about them unless it scratches you a funny way. This is your thalamus stopping that feeling of your clothes on your body all the time, all day. So it really sort of controls what's going up there. Our hypothalamus, which is just below it here, that's a really important center for our autonomic nervous system. It's a brain area of control for our viscera. It's important for our physical response for emotions, are regulating things like temperature, appetite, thirst, our sleep-wake cycles. It also is really important in our endocrine system, our hormone system, because it sort of gives off precursor hormones for our pituitary gland, which is right below it here. We're going to talk more about hormones next time. But that's our hypothalamus. Lots of control over our autonomic nervous system. And then we have our epithalamus, which is just above here. And our pineal gland is there. And that's really important for sleep-wake cycles as well. So we have our brain stem, which is along here, and our brain stem extends down, and our spinal cord is at the bottom, which then extends down into our vertebral column. Our brainstem is really important for autonomic survival behaviors. Really deep down, long established evolutionary survival behaviors. It has really, it has centers for things like our heart, our cardiac center. It controls things like our heart rate, our respiratory center, controlling things like our respiratory rate. It also has centers that are involved with things like vomiting and coughing, hiccuping and swallowing. And then it also has a section where we have all these little cranial nerves that come off of it, which are involved with things like our eyesight and our eye movement, and also very important parasympathetic influences, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then we have this little brain back here, our cerebellum. It's that small little area at the back bottom area of the brain, which looks like a smaller brain. And that's an important area for coordinated movement. So smooth movement, movement that we don't think about, subconscious movement. It has important connections to our vestibular system, which is the system that keeps our balance and posture. And if you can think of, like, we need to know where we are in space in order to have like smooth and controlled coordinated movement. One thing I always think about with this is just sort of like that, like bringing food to your mouth is generally something you don't have to think about too much, but it is like a very coordinated movement with multiple muscles, multiple body parts in different areas. So our whole brain is covered in connective tissue, which protects it. And basically it's 3 layers of connective tissue. They're called our meninges. The most outer layer that's right under the bone is called our dura mater. And then second to that is our arachnoid mater, and this is between this layer of connective tissue and the very deepest one called the pia mater, where we have our cerebral spinal fluid travel. And this is fluid that surrounds the brain, it surrounds the spinal cord, and it kind of gives a buoyancy cushion to it. It protects things, it protects the blood vessels around. The meninges also divide the skull into different areas as well. So we have like a center division, a division between our cerebral cortex and our cerebellum. And then a quick look at our spinal cord too, which extends down from our brain stem. And our spinal cord actually only comes down to about L1 or L2. So it's not quite as long as our vertebral column. And this is because the spinal cord and the vertebral column grow at different rates. The vertebral column grows faster, and once that happens, the spinal cord ends up having sort of a stretching of nerve roots The cord ends at L1 or L2, but we still have nerve roots that travel between our lower lumbar vertebra and exit those vertebrae. So the cord ends at L1 or L2. So all the cell bodies for these neurons is between like in the brain and down the spinal cord to L1 or L2. And then we start having axon terminals that travel down the rest of the vertebral column. This sort of area is called the cauda equina, which I think is Latin for something like a horse's tail, because you're going to have all these like fibers running, which I guess looks like a horse's tail when you divide up a cadaver. And then this whole structure is also surrounded by those 3 layers of meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid for buoyancy and protection. The cerebral spinal fluid also is nourishment as well. So just hopping over to the questions, which is mostly about the slides. So I'm sorry about that. Yasmin, the image about the nervous system where you asked, is this a model? I remember seeing something like that, the bodies exhibit. Actually, I'm not sure if you mean the very first image on the front cover or the nervous system dissection. The front cover, I think, is something like from the bodies exhibit. It's just an image I found online. Okay, so we chatted a little bit about the nervous system last time with the muscles. So the muscular connection to the nervous system. And before we sort of get into that again, I just wanted to show that this is sort of a cross section of what the spinal cord would be like. And we have sort of this white area on the outside, and then we have, this would be more gray matter on the inside. The white are axons, nerve axons that are surrounded by myelin, the myelin sheath, the fatty tissue, and the gray would not have that. But just generally in terms of communication in the nervous system, sensory always comes in the back of the spinal cord, and motor or efferent signals always leave the front. Sort of to just retouch the connection of the muscular system with the nervous system. If we have a voluntary movement, we have this area up in our cerebral cortex called our motor cortex, which we're going to have this decision that we want to move a muscle, and that signal is going to come down our spinal cord to the appropriate level of our spinal segments. So say if it's the quadriceps, that would be like L2 to L3. And then it's going to have this little synapse, which is where the neurotransmitters travel from the axon terminal of one nerve to the dendrites of another. And then we're going to have that signal leave along our peripheral nerve, in which case this would be our femoral nerve, and it's going to then have an effect on our muscle at the end of the axon terminals of this nerve. I gave some charts of the cervical brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexuses in the notes. They're not as extensive as what's out there, but it's sort of a nice beginning to look at. But you'll definitely see the major nerves for like the lumbosacral plexus, the brachial plexus, and the cervical plexus. And then there's just, if there's an involuntary movement, we're going to have in the muscular system, we're going to have an impulse coming from our cerebellum or brainstem, and that's going to come down again into the appropriate spinal level in order to send out an impulse through our motor nerve. So just sort of like an illustration of some of these nerves that affect our muscular system. In our lumbosacral plexus, I pulled out some of the big ones. So our sciatic nerve, which is like probably, I think, our largest nerve in our body. It comes from L4 to S3, and it innervates your whole posterior thigh, your hamstrings here, and then it basically innervates your entire lower leg and foot. So this is a very big and important motor influence on movement of the leg. With our femoral nerve, L2 to L3, that's our whole anterior compartment of our thigh. So our quadriceps, our sartorius, and then our obturator, which is also L2 to L4, is more the medial side of our leg, or adductors here. When it comes to nerve roots, these are where the nerves exit the vertebral column, and you might find different sources where like they give like here or there like a slightly different level. Generally with the muscular system it's pretty set, but particularly with the autonomics, you might find it like one vertebra above, vertebral level above or below, and it just, everyone's a little different, and it'll depend on what your cadaver was like for whoever was making that resource. And then looking into the arms, some big ones, your radial nerve, which innervates the triceps here, and then all the extensors of the forearm, and musculocutaneous, which is like biceps brachii, brachial brachialis, and then our median nerve, which is all the flexors of our lower forearm. If you've experienced carpal tunnel before, that's the nerve that gets irritated in your wrist. If coming around the top of the radius of the elbow, that's the radial nerve, which can get irritated there. And if you bump your elbow, that's the ulnar nerve that you're feeling. But just some ideas of sort of where some of these nerves innervate muscles, and some big movement muscles for your yoga practice. Oh, one to note actually on your cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve, which comes from C3 to C5. That comes from your neck, C3 to C5. It travels down your thorax and innervates your respiratory diaphragm. So that's a really big, important one as well. Okay, so our autonomic nervous system. So this is our sympathetic system, our parasympathetic system. So sort of speaking to our sympathetics first, this is our fight or flight system. This is a system that comes in when we're excited, or when we're having an emergency, or we're threatened. This causes an increased heart rate, it causes sweating, it increases your respiratory rates, it dilates your pupils so you can see a lot. It's kind of all important things for keeping yourself alive if you're in an emergency situation. These nerves come from your thoracic spine and your upper lumbar, so basically T1 to L2. And we have a bunch of different effects that come about with the sympathetic system. So in terms of, sorry, I'm just moving around so I can see my screen here. So in terms of eyes, it dilates the pupils so you can see a lot, which is important. If you're having an emergency, you want to be able to see your surroundings. It inhibits salivation, because when you're in a sympathetic response, digestion is not your primary need. Basically, the body vasoconstricts through your digestive tract in order to shunt blood to your extremities. So you want lots of blood going to your extremities in order to deliver lots of oxygen and lots of nutrients to the muscles, so that you can run or fight or whatever you need to do. And this is an extreme example of like a sympathetic situation. If you're running from a tiger, you need those muscles fueled so you can run fast. You don't need to be putting your focus into digestion. It also dilates the bronchioles in your lungs, so you have lots of surface area and you can get lots of oxygen into your body to fuel those muscles. And it causes your liver to release glucose into your body, so that you, again, still have fuel to fuel for those big muscles to run from your tiger. So digestion is dampened, reproductive organs are not important in this sort of a situation. So our parasympathetics is our rest and recover area. So here, this is where digestion, elimination are key and important. This is where they happen. In this system, our pupils constrict because we don't need to see as much. Our blood pressure lowers, our heart rate lowers, our respiration rate lowers. I read somewhere that a perfect example of a parasympathetic system is someone who's just had a big dinner and is sitting on the couch reading. So their digestion is going, their elimination systems are working, their pupils are constricted because they're reading something close to them and they're relaxing. Again, like a very extreme example of a parasympathetic system. These nerves come from two very specific areas of our body. So they come either from our cranium or from our sacrum. So two ends of the system. In terms of the cranial nerves, we have our oculomotor nerve, which is going to influence the pupils. We have our facial and our glossopharyngeal nerves, which are going to influence the salivary glands. Also the lacrimal glands in the case of the facial nerve, which are tear ducts. And then the big one is our vagus nerve. And our vagus nerve comes from our brainstem. It travels down through our neck and basically innervates every organ until about the last third of our large intestine. So it innervates our esophagus, our stomach, our liver, our gallbladder, our spleen, our pancreas, small intestine, hearts, lungs, large intestine, all the way to 2/3 in. And then the rest of the large intestine is innervated by nerves from our sacrum, or pelvic splanchnic nerves. So that innervates the bottom third of our large intestine, our colon, our reproductive organs. As you can see, like a big heavy hitter one is our vagus here. And then coming closer in proximity, we have our pelvic splanchnic nerves that innervate sort of the rest. So kind of in the example of like running away from a tiger or sitting after a big meal reading, two extremes of like nervous system responses. In regular life, we generally aren't always in those two situations. There's always a fine balance between the two systems. So there's always going to be balance between the parasympathetics and the sympathetics. It's not necessarily one or the other. They're always kind of working in tandem, rebalancing in order to maintain homeostasis in our body. So it's kind of a little bit of one system, a little bit of another system, and they rebalance in order to keep us level. Of course, in today's world, there are a lot of sympathetic triggers and influences, from the noise that we hear to world events, especially this past year. And so work stress, all these kinds of things that sort of amp up our sympathetic state. But in general, like in terms of like control through our viscera and our smooth muscle and all of that, there's balance that kind of has to happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about pain. I'm sure we've all experienced some different pains. And we all experience pain in a different way. It's a very personal experience. But we'll first talk about how it's felt. So we have different receptors in our body. They're sensory receptors. They pick up changes in our environment, changes within ourselves. There are a few different kinds. There are mechanical receptors or mechanoreceptors, which pick up on things like touch or pressure. So like this feather here, this is a mechanoreceptor. Vibration, stretch. These mechanoreceptors will pick up on those sort of special cues. We have thermal receptors, which pick up on temperature. We have photoreceptors, which are specific to our retinas and pick up light. And then we have chemoreceptors, which pick up on changes of like chemical compositions. It also picks up things like molecules, like, for example, molecules of things that we taste or smell. And then we have nociceptors, and nociceptors are specific pain receptors. They pick up on damaging stimuli, but they're kind of subreceptors to the other ones. So we have mechano type nociceptors, which will pick up on things like excessive pressure or stretch or that kind of thing that will cause pain or tissue damage. We have thermal receptors, which are nociceptors, which will pick up on like extreme heat, like burning or extreme cold. We have chemoreceptors, which are also nociceptors, which will pick up on things like changes, like inflammatory chemicals, changes in chemical composition, which cause pain. So nociceptors are the receptor that pick up on these sort of damaging signals, and they send that impulse along their axons back into the central nervous system. So it comes into this back of the spinal column, and that's called a first order neuron. From here, you end up sending neurotransmitters onto a second nerve pathway. And this actually crosses over the spine. So that's actually kind of interesting because, so for example, if I stuck a pin into my right hand, I'm going to feel the pain. The pain is going to register on the left side of my brain because as the signal crosses over the spine, it travels up the opposite side of the spinal cord. So the second nerve comes all the way up the cord into the thalamus. And here in the thalamus decides, is this an important signal or not? And the thing with pain is that it's a signal to tell us that we need to change something that's happening. So the thalamus is then going to pass this signal along to our sensory cortex or somatosensory cortex. And this is actually the spot where we start to feel pain. This is the thing that actually makes us aware that something painful is happening. If this isn't happening at the somatosensory cortex, we're not registering that this tack is going into my finger. So it's a long pathway to get up to the brain, to tell the brain that I'm in pain. And then there are some different things that can happen. So like I said before, pain is a very personal experience, and there are many different things that can influence it. People's perception of pain is different. Something that might be not painful to one person may be like something that triggers someone else. Or very painful to someone else. And different things that can influence this are things like genetics, also things like situation or emotions that are happening in the moment while that painful stimulus is happening. The person who's experiencing pain, like their attention and understanding of what's happening. Like, for example, have I felt this pain before? What was the outcome when I felt this pain before? like, do they have an experience with that? Are they paying attention to it? Are they not paying attention to it? Things like how much control you have over it, or your expectations of it. Like, for example, like, you know, I'm feeling this pain now, but I know it's going to end at this time. Or, you know, when I ask the dentist to stop drilling my tooth, or, you know, if you have control over it. There's also some different ways that pain can be kind of overridden in the system. So I kind of talked about this a little bit last time about how cold will change the sensation. So in terms of that, like, if you start applying cold to a painful area, your system starts picking up the cold signal, and that overrides the pain signal. The other thing is pressure, where if you have, and obviously feather is not pressure, but if you have mechanoreceptor pressure influence, that can override the pain sensation going into the body. And that's actually kind of a reflex that we have. Like, if you bump your knee against something, almost automatically grab it and hold it. And that's you're automatically sort of overriding that pain sensation. I mean, obviously, if you have some severe, horrible accident, applying cold is not necessarily going to override that pain sensation, but in general, like, those are a couple things that can mediate what's happening through the nervous system. There's also, though, an option that the brain has, and in times of great stress, the brain can actually send signals back down into the core, down a descending pathway in the spinal tract, to interrupt these signals being sent by the pain receptors. And this is a way that your brain can actually suppress pain as well. So, for example, like think of an example of like a grandma like lifting a car off their grandchild, where like this extreme stressful situation kind of overrides any pain that might happen in that. Or like, if you are, you know, attacked and hurt yourself, the duress of that situation, your brain is able to override some pain so you can get yourself away. So there's this interesting connection of the brain and influence of the brain on pain. With that, there is, if someone is experiencing long-lasting, intense pain, it can trigger receptors that strengthen neural connections and make your nervous system more sensitive to pain. In which case, over time, the system can become, because it's sort of learned these learned this connection of pain, over time, it can become more sensitive, and where now someone might be having much more chronic pain, and stimulus that wasn't as great can start triggering more and more pain. And then the opposite of that is that with the brain being able to have this influence on pain as well, it can also be trained to sort of turn off its attention to pain signals that aren't useful, and learn to pay attention to pain signals that are useful. So if you're having a pain signal because you're having tissue damage, that's an important pain signal. But if you're having a pain signal because your system has become more sensitive, like being able to turn that signal off would be important. So there is this, like, that's kind of folding into like a mindfulness-based approach of like pain management. But it's just kind of interesting connections of how much it's the brain and the mind that influences pain and senses pain in the body. in terms of overall health and wellness, just how much like emotional and mental health is really important for all our well-being as well. In terms of pain in the viscera, the pain receptors in the viscera are fewer and farther between. They sort of pick up things more like stretching, oxygen, like lack of oxygen, inflammation, and that can be like a more dull pain, but it often refers, it's not necessarily right in the organ that you're feeling it. Oftentimes pain in the viscera will refer to another part of the body. So for example, like some really common ones are the heart will refer to the left shoulder, the left jaw, down the left arm. The liver or the gallbladder will refer to the right shoulder. The kidneys and the ureters, like if someone's passing a kidney stone, that's like flank area. But overall, like I said both earlier, pain is a warning system. It lets us know there's danger and that we need to take a proactive approach to something, to change something, to avoid damage. Okay. So blood, we're going to talk about the arteries and veins, and the thing that travels through them is blood. So blood is another kind of connective tissue. So we've talked about a few different kinds of connective tissue and connective tissue in terms of fascia, but blood is a specialized connective tissue. So what makes it different is that it lacks collagen and elastin fibers. Sort of the components that make it connective tissue is that it has living cells that are within a matrix. And in the case of blood, it's a fluid matrix, which is the blood plasma. So the important things about blood is that it distributes things throughout the body. It sends oxygen, nutrients to our blood cells. It helps remove wastes. It'll take like metabolic wastes from our cellular activity, and it'll send it off to our lungs, or it'll send it off to our kidneys for our body to get rid of. It also transports hormones. It's important for regulation. So for example, temperature and heat in our body. It has proteins in it that help keep pH balances from making extreme changes. It also it actually protects itself because it has clotting factors in it that keeps blood keep us from losing blood. But it also transports immune cells to help protect against infection. Let's see. So actually, the red blood cells, so that is where our oxygen transports through our body on our red blood cells. It picks up oxygen in the capillaries of our lungs, and then it travels through our body and releases the oxygen to our cells once it hits the capillaries in the rest of our body. The red blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow of our bones. And that production is actually stimulated by our kidneys and our liver. Our white blood cells are important for immune response, and those are also initially produced in the red bone marrow of our bones. White blood cells kind of have a fun transportation through the body because they can actually slip out of the arteries and veins and slip into that extracellular interstitial space, like in the fluid between our cells and those collagen fibers of our connective tissue. And they will slip out of there if they need to like mount an immune attack on something. Our body will actually also go into white blood cell production if it's under some kind of like immune system attack, like if it needs to take care of something. For example, if you come up with an infection or a bacteria, your body will start producing so that it can really stage a nice attack on that. And then our platelets are like little pieces of bigger cells, and they help clot, or they help form, or they're important for blood clotting. So they're really important for that protection function of our blood. So the cardiopulmonary system, so at the heart of it is our heart. Our heart just sits behind our sternum, and it sits on top of our respiratory diaphragm, and it's covered in connective tissue called our pericardium. And it's basically made out of a very special muscle called cardiac muscle. It has a lot of blood vessels that supply that muscle that sit outside the heart. So it's actually not supplied by blood that travels through the heart. It has its own blood supply, which comes from arteries outside of the heart, and that feeds the heart muscle. So it has 4 chambers within it: the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and the left atrium. The right atrium receives blood that is now poorly oxygenated because it's been traveling through our body and our cells have been using that oxygen. And that comes in through our inferior vena cava or superior vena cava or our coronary sinus. And it comes into the atrium, and then it travels into our right ventricle. And with the contraction of the heart, it pushes out into our pulmonary artery and starts traveling in through around our lungs, where in the capillaries of the lungs, it will get rid of the carbon dioxide, and it'll pick up the oxygen. And once it's full of oxygen, it comes back into the heart through our pulmonary vein into our left atrium. It comes down into our left ventricle. And then with the contraction of the heart, it pushes out into our aorta and into our systemic circulation. Between all of these chambers, there are little valves. So actually you can see a nice little valve between the left ventricle and the pulmonary artery here. And basically what that's like is sort of like connective tissue, like little flaps that come over. So as the fluid pushes out with the contraction, once that heart relaxes, the valves close, and then that fluid can't backtrack back into the heart. And I mean, sometimes people have issues with their valves and there's like a bit of backflow, and that's something that a cardiologist would look at. But basically you have these little flaps that kind of keep that backflow from happening and keep the fluid pushing forward into the next area of its circulation. One thing that's very cool about the heart is that it's a special intrinsic conduction system. So it doesn't actually need the nervous system in order to beat. The heart cells send a signal like from cell to cell to cell, which causes the heart to contract. So if you saw someone transplanting a heart, when the heart was removed from the donor patient, it will still continue to beat even though it no longer has a nervous supply to it. So that's just something very cool and special about the heart. But it is under nervous system influence. And if our sympathetic nervous system is ramped up, you're going to have a heart that beats faster. And if our parasympathetics are ramping up, it will beat slower. So even though it has its own way to beat, it's not completely dependent on the nervous system. So traveling through the body, so the blood leaves the heart, and when it leaves the heart, the full of oxygen is going to start through our arterial system. So our arterial system is a series of vessels. The first big one is our aorta, and then it will also fill in some arteries supplying the heart, because our heart's really important. So we're going to have these arteries initially right out of the heart where it supplies itself. But it comes into our aorta, which is a nice big vessel, and travels down through our body. The aorta branches into like arteries and arterioles that branch off of it. And basically they just get smaller and smaller. Arterioles are smaller than the arteries. And then we get into the very smallest vessel, which is our capillary. So when we hit our capillaries, these are the smallest vessels in our body, and they can be so small, one red blood cell can pass through it at a time, and it might even need to kind of fold in on itself in order to get through. And when you come into the capillaries, you have many that kind of join together, creating a capillary bed. And this is where our arterial blood ends up flowing into our venous blood. So basically what happens in this capillary bed, this is the area where we have an exchange in things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, where our nutrients slip in to feed our cells, where waste comes out of like metabolic waste from our cellular activities comes out into the venous supply, or oxygen comes in to feed the cells. So this is the area of exchange. This is where all of those important components that keep our body going actually get into the area to get into our cells. This is also where white blood cells, if they need to mount like an immune response and they need to get into that interstitial space, this is where they'll slip out of the capillary system and into the extracellular matrix. So from here, we have these tiny little capillaries that are becoming less oxygenated. They're picking up the waste. And then they're going to come through our venous system, our veins. So the smallest ones after the capillaries are the venules, and then they come into the veins. Our big ones for return are inferior vena cava and our superior vena cava, which then dumps back into our heart to become reoxygenated. So there are some differences between this sort of the mechanisms behind the movement of the blood in our arteries and our veins. With the arteries, we have this big pumping system directly pushing blood out into that system. It creates a lot of pressure when blood first dumps out into the arteries. And then we have muscle in the vessels of the arteries that also helps push that blood along. In terms of the venous system, we do have muscle in those veins, but it's not as thick, it's not as strong. And we also kind of are at a disadvantage with this drainage because we're going against gravity for a lot of the time. So the venous system is sort of considered like a low pressure system, whereas the arterial system is a higher pressure system because you have that initial big contraction of the heart pushing the blood. So in terms of the venous drainage, there are some things to help it along. One of the things we have valves in our veins, especially in our legs and our arms, that help keep that blood sort of shunted in compartments up the legs. So much like the heart, when the blood is pushed up, the valve closes. As it sort of backflows, the valve closes and it gets stuck in that compartment instead of backflowing further down the leg. This is so long as the valves are working well. If the valves are not working well, you might have like things like varicose veins, that kind of thing. But the valves will help in the extremities to kind of like shunt the blood up into sections towards the heart. We also have muscular contraction. Muscular contraction helps with both the arteries and veins, especially once you get like into like a capillary sort of level of vessel. But basically with the contraction of our skeletal muscles, they will squeeze the deep veins of like our legs and our arms, and it'll help push the blood up towards the heart, like kind of like milking the vein. Our respiratory diaphragm is very important with the movement of the blood through the venous system. So we talked last time about how when we breathe, there's sort of pressure changes between the thorax and the abdomen. When we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and it increases the pressure in the abdomen and decreases the pressure in the thorax. As we exhale, the diaphragm redomes, and that decreases the pressure in the abdomen and increases the pressure in the thorax. And with these pressure changes, it creates a little bit of a pressure pump, and that sucks the fluid up through these low pressure systems. So breathing is very important for the movement of that. Then we have influence from our autonomic nervous system, specifically if we have some sympathetic tone being sent to those smooth muscles in the vessels, that will constrict the vein, which is called venoconstriction. And if you're constricting the vein, it pushes, like it creates a smaller space, so the fluid has to push along. Okay. So more vessels, but in our lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is also a drainage system. And it drains our interstitial space, so that extracellular matrix area of our body. So that space of fluid between our cells and our collagen, our elastin fibers in that extracellular space. So it's kind of its own drainage system, but it does eventually dump everything that flows through it into our venous system. So we have the same kind of idea as the other vessels, where we have very small vessels called lymphatic capillaries, and they basically come they come together, they push the fluid up into a larger vessel, or lymphatic vessels. Eventually it'll get into, those vessels will come together to form a larger trunk. Finally, the last kind of spot is our lymphatic ducts, which are actually kind of basically right behind our sternoclavicular joints here, where our clavicle comes into our sternum. And then here, that's where it dumps into our venous circulation, which it comes into an area between our subclavian vein, which comes off from our arm here, and our internal jugular vein. So they basically come back into circulation, into our regular blood circulation, right below our SC joints, or sternoclavicular joints. And what the lymphatic system actually sort of moves is any excess fluid that's happening in the interstitial space here, that'll move through the lymphatic system. Proteins that are like too big to be picked up back into venous circulation will go into our lymphatic system. And it actually has a very special function in our digestive tract, where the fat that we eat will be absorbed through the lymphatic system, which we'll chat about next time when we talk about organs. But those are some different things that go through there. And the lymphatic system is also a lower pressure system. It has smooth muscles in the walls of the vessels, but It's not as much as the arteries. It certainly doesn't have a pump like the heart to it. So it has some different things that can influence its drainage as well. And it's very similar to the veins. But skeletal muscle contraction will help push the lymphatics. Things like passive motion of the extremities, or like surface pressure on the extremities. So for example, if you go for body work where they move your limbs around or massage you, or if you do self-massage, that's helping to move fluid through the lymphatic system. It'll even respond to things like internal movement, like pulse, like the arterial pulse, that like vibration and movement, that'll help move through the lymphatic system. Even also to movements like the peristalsis in the digestive tract, as your digestive organs are sort of pushing food along, that like on off movement pressure of the intestines, that will help move fluid in the lymphatics as well. And it also has influence from the autonomic nervous system. So sympathetic influence on the smooth muscle of the lymphatic vessels will help contract those vessels and make them constrict, whereas the parasympathetic tone on those smooth vessels will help the vessels expand. They are also a valve system. You can see a little valve here on this little illustration, or here. So it also has a sort of like tissue stop from having fluid backflow. And then when we have inflammation happen in our body, if we're having an infection or tissue damage, the excess fluid will help push like debris and microorganisms and that kind of thing into the lymphatic system, where it's going to get checked by the immune system. So just a little chat about a couple of lymphatic or immune cells. Lymphocytes are immune cells within the lymphatic system. They are white blood cells, and they're produced in the red bone marrow. And they have a special job where they determine the specificity of an immune response to like a foreign body or a virus or bacteria. So there are a couple different kinds. There are T cells, which sort of manage an immune attack. And they actually learn, they become educated as they mature in our body to sort of pick out a certain kind of like bacteria or virus. And so these cells just kind of hang out and they're waiting. And if they see this virus, they'll like make it known that this is here and start an attack on it. So T cells will manage that response because they're educated and sort of like they're learning different viruses and bacteria and things to attack. And then we have B cells, which are also lymphocytes, and they'll produce a certain kind of cell that secretes antibodies that will also help attack viruses and bacteria and these kinds of things that can start getting stuck in the lymphatic system through the drainage of the lymph. So we have nodes along the lymphatic tract. So our lymph nodes. We've probably all have felt swollen lymph nodes before. If you've had like a strep throat or a sore throat, you've probably felt them on your neck before. Lymph nodes have a couple of special special functions. One is filtration. They'll help filter things from the fluid so that they don't go back into the systemic blood distribution. So things like cellular debris or microorganisms, they'll pick that out so it doesn't go back into the blood circulation. It has these cells that are just waiting here for different antigens to flag an attack. So any viruses or bacteria or things like that come through, they're just waiting there to take care of those. The flow of fluid into a lymph node is a lot faster than the flow out of it. So when it comes in, it kind of sticks around for a little bit of time, and that gives the body a chance to really filter these things out and make an attack on things that shouldn't be there. And then if they're overwhelmed with things like bacteria and viruses and that kind of thing, then they'll become swollen and painful, and then you'll know that, oh man, I have an infection and I need to take care of myself. And then we have before we talk about lymphoid organs, we'll find a lot of lymph nodes sort of like in our inguinal area, in our groin, a lot under our arm, a lot in the neck. These areas are also behind the knee. These areas are also like big areas for drainage for the venous system as well. Being in the folds of these like body parts, they're getting a lot of movement that will help pump things through as well. So just kind of a side note on low pressure fluid drainage as well. These sort of confluences of these vessels in the folds of the body, like as we move, we're constantly pumping through there. So back into the lymphatic system, lymphoid organs, there's some organs that are associated with the lymphatic system. We have our spleen, which is an important organ for the system because it's where the lymphocytes proliferate and produce and reproduce, and we develop more. It's also an area where we have a large immune system, sort of surveillance and response. And it's also an organ where we have a lot of blood filtration coming through, where it cleans the blood of debris and foreign matter. Our thymus, which is an organ that is more predominant in children. It is at the bottom of our neck, upper thorax, behind our sternum here. It's more predominant in children, and it does start to atrophy when we hit puberty. But it actually is an area where these lymphocytes, the T cells mature and become educated. And they still do that as we get older and as the organ atrophies, but it's just not quite as much as when we're a child. Like children have big immune responses to things as their system is learning to take care of things. But that's our thymus is another lymphoid organ. And then our tonsils, which are going to pick up things that we breathe in and things that we eat. And then like the tonsils, we have sort of a similar structures, our Prager's patches in our small intestine. These are at the end of the small intestine, right before it comes into the large intestine. And like the tonsils are going to pick up things like bacteria and that kind of thing, but through our digestive tract. And the appendix is another one like that. This is at the beginning of our large intestine, and it's also going to pick up like bacteria through our digestive tract. So I'm going to talk about an acute tissue inflammation. So this is what happens when we injure tissue. It's a process that happens when our tissue is damaged. So this might be something like if you like slice your finger with something, or you tear a muscle, or you have an infection, or all kinds of things like that that might be causing tissue damage. And the purpose of this response is it prevents anything that's damaging from spreading to other tissue. It helps dispose of like dead cell debris and the pathogens that are causing it. It helps alert the immune system that, you know, we need some help over here. And it starts to set the stage for repair, for tissue repair. So short-term acute tissue inflammation, we've all probably had like an injury that this has happened for, where we have redness, we have heat, there's some swelling, and there's pain. And basically the whole process kind of, the way it happens will demonstrate why all these things happen. So when we first injure a tissue, the tissue releases chemicals, inflammatory chemicals that into the extracellular fluid. So sorry, I pulled out our connective tissue picture here because it has a nice image of our extracellular fluid. So when we damage tissue, these chemicals all flow into this extracellular tissue, and it basically sets off a little alarm in your body saying, there's damage happening here, we need help. And the inflammatory chemicals attract white blood cells, and it helps the capillaries dilate and become more leaky. So they start pulling in or pushing in fluid, more fluid into this extracellular space. But in this fluid, there's blood clotting factors, there's white blood cells. And as this fluid comes in, you start getting redness because there's more blood in the area. You get swelling because there's more fluid. You get heat because there's more blood. And you get pain because the pressure of the fluid is going to excite like a pain nerve endings. You're also going to get pain because the chemical change in the fluid or in the area is also going to excite those nociceptors. But as we get this fluid dumping into this area that's been damaged, it pushes pathogens and foreign material into the lymphatic capillaries so that it can start being processed by our lymphatic system and our cells and our immune cells in our lymphatic system. So it starts pushing some of the fluid out. With everything that came into this area, with the fluid that came in, clotting factors came in. And what that does is it starts forming a mesh over whatever it needs to be, whatever area needs to be repaired. So it starts adding like this little scaffolding as like a little patchwork mesh to start the repair process. This is important because it sort of isolates the injury and it keeps anything that's harmful there from spreading to other tissues. And with that, the immune system starts kicking up its white blood cell production and sending all kinds of white blood cells to the area to help devour and destroy any like bacteria or viruses or harmful substances in the area. So the goals of this whole process is to remove dead tissue cells and also any other debris and pathogens so that healing can start. And this whole process kind of takes one to a few days after the initial injury, maybe like 1 to 4 days. But the whole process also kind of requires a constant stimulation. So once the immune system takes care of that like invading pathogen, or the scaffolding is sort of set across the wound, um, this acute inflammatory response can subside. Um, After that, it goes through a couple other stages. There's the proliferative stage, which begins after the acute tissue stage. This is our body starts laying down collagen to help rebuild that area that was damaged. And then after that, which can actually take kind of like 6 months to a year, is our remodeling stage, where our body continues putting collagen down and it actually contracts it so it becomes stronger and scar tissue is formed and that area becomes healed. Different tissues sort of take different amounts of time for healing, and depending on the injury. Like muscles have greater blood supply, so they tend to heal faster. If you have like a delayed onset muscle soreness from exercise, that's like a no time to a few days kind of healing. But if you have a major muscle tear, that could take months to heal. Ligaments don't have as good blood supply. If you have a minor sprain, it might take a few days, but if you have a major sprain, it could take over a year to heal. So different tissues kind of heal at different rates depending on their blood supply. But this is sort of the process that the body goes through. And then, unfortunately, if this process goes a little awry, we can also have long-term, slow, chronic inflammation that happens. And a few things that can bring this about is if you have an acute tissue inflammation process happening, but the body's unable to take care of the trigger, the pathogen. For example, if there's, say, like a parasite that the body just couldn't take care of through its own immunity, and it remains in the body over an extended amount of time, this could set up for a chronic inflammation situation. If you're exposed long-term to like low levels of chemicals or irritants, that can also set up like a long-term chronic inflammation situation. Autoimmune disorders, where the body's immune system mistakes its own tissues as invading cells, like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, those kinds of conditions, that is going to set up like a chronic long-term inflammation. And then also if there's like a defect in this, like the cells in the immune system that are taking care of the inflammation process. Yeah, so that is, I'm just gonna see if there are any questions here. Which, okay, Yasmin asked, how do you know if shoulder pain is shoulder trouble or liver trouble in reference to referral pain? It tends to be that if it's an organ referral, like a visceral referral to the shoulder, it's going to, it's not, the pain won't change depending on position. It's going to be constant. Whereas a shoulder pain, you may have certain areas of particular discomfort and areas that are not as uncomfortable. Also, sort of like an intensity of pain. If you have like really sharp pain, that is more likely going to be like a shoulder injury, versus like more of a dull pain. And that's not like a dull muscular pain. Also too, healing time. If a shoulder is not improving, with movement, with rest, with heat, with therapy, it's always, if there's not sort of an expected improvement in its response, then I always recommend people to get the shoulder image. If there's nothing happening in the shoulder, then maybe further investigation is warranted. Yeah, so Yasmin just mentioned, I was told in yoga training that pain and rest is like the liver stuff. So yeah, if you're not moving the shoulder at all and you're still feeling pain, that's an indication it's like possibly referral as opposed to something that's actually the shoulder. With shoulder pain, like if you have, for example, like rotator cuff issues, there are going to be certain positions that are uncomfortable. Like for example, a rotator cuff, like usually abduction, bringing the arm up is quite painful. Like different, if you have like a labrum tear, which is like the connective tissue inside the shoulder, there's going to be certain areas that are going to cause more acute pain, whereas like an organ referral is going to be more constant. And what happens when our feet fall asleep, as experienced by many people during meditation. So in terms of feet falling asleep, I think I don't have a definitive answer, but I think that has a lot to do with circulation. We have all our major circulation going through the folds of our body, and the positions we tend to meditate in, a lot of those folds are closed and compressed, whether you're sitting with your legs sort of crossed, or whatever different position. If you're not moving, your fluids aren't, it sort of impedes the movement of the fluids as well. And when it comes down to our nerves, they are also innervated, or they also have blood that supply them as well. So I think it's like a fluid movement drainage issue that affects the nerves. And yeah, so that's what I've got for you today. Next time we're going to talk about organs. We've started a little bit of talk about organs today, but we're going to talk about organs, digestive tract, hormones, and if you have any questions about that coming up, feel free to email me, and I can try to address them during the next talk.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I feel like, I don't know if anyone else feels the same, but I feel like this is something that has to be rewatched because there's so much information crammed into such a short amount of time. How long did it take you to study all this? Probably months.
Well, I did
years.
My program was 4 years, so it was 4 years of study, and then I would say it's a constant study, because like as much as you can cram in your brain at one time, certain things go to the wayside, and until you have specific experiences where you kind of have to pull them back in and relook at things, and with the body, like there's so much that is known, but there's so much I think that is still to be discovered and still working out. Like even our discussion last time about like heat versus ice, and like just sort of like changing approaches, like it's sort of in constant flux, much like we are. So it's really cool, everything, how it comes together and how much like everything relates in the body. But I feel like once you get into it, it's sort of a constant study.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's also interesting because when you talk about pain, and how it's so personal, Ayurveda actually like identifies which doshas experience pain and how, or like how different doshas experience pain.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that in our Ayurvedic program. But anyway,
That's
it's
excellent.
late. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Jen.
Have a good night.
Good night.